Alright, the master-slave morality. As we discussed earlier in the last video, there's those that have a low will to power and a high will to power. Likewise, Nietzsche said there are those who have the master morality and there are those who subscribe to the master morality and there are those that subscribe to the slave morality. Now, I don't want you to go ahead and start thinking when I say master and slave morality that I'm in any way referring to the Civil War. No dice. Rather, master morality is defined as someone who bases their moral on a high will to power. Examples of this are beauty, strength, fame. These all derive from a master morality. He also goes on to say about the master morality that society, folks, there's no such thing as an equal society. No one is really equal. Because if everyone was really equal, then there'd be no one in charge. It's the primary human condition that in our social hierarchies, there's got to be someone in charge. Usually, it's the one that has the high will to power. So equality to Nietzsche was about as dated as a flat earth. All right? No such thing as equality. It can exist because if equality did exist, there'd be no one in charge. And then what do you get? A type of anarchy, and it was briefly explored in socialism or communism, and we see how those countries fared out. All right? But now what about those that have a slave type of morality? Well, Nietzsche says that obviously those are the ones that have a low degree of will to power. And when morality is created by the oppressed, if you have a slave morality, you essentially subscribe to this type of thinking that, hey, I'm oppressed, that I am no more than a sheep in life, and that the only way that type of slave morality can be, worthwhile, the only way that a slave morality can be worthwhile is when the slaves overcome the masters. Alright? So, the perfect example that Nietzsche gives, and you'll read this in the book, is the example of the rise of Christianity. Alright? The rise of Christianity is a perfect example of those that once had a low will to power, eventually, that obviously they had the slave morality, but how that slave morality can now become a master morality. He brings up the rise of Christianity. Christians, back in the day, when they were first getting off the ground, had the slave morality. Alright? They were prosecuted by the Romans, prosecuted by the Jews, they were prosecuted by the lions, they were prosecuted by everybody. Alright? But then what happened? Well, Constantine noticed that the winds were changing, that he was a politician and he knew that his society were growing more and more Christian. And so he then identified Christianity as being the official religion of the Roman Empire. And what happened is those Christians then overthrew the pagans, they overthrew the Jews, they overthrew anyone that got in their way. And we still left with this type of mentality, at least in the West. And this is when a slave type of morality can become the master morality. And the number one reason, according to Nietzsche, that Christianity was able, that this type of overthrow that Christianity was able to execute, the number one weapon that they had in their arsenal was guilt. Alright? Guilt was their number one weapon. But they were able to persuade a lot of people, especially those with the slave morality, those with the low degree of power. They were able to persuade them by saying, hey, you may be a slave on earth, but you're going to be a master in the afterlife. And if you're living out in the desert, and if that was you, hey, this sounds like a win-win situation, doesn't it? And so a lot of people converted that way. And so we can see, at least in that way, how the slave morality, those with the low will to power, through their own acts of creation, were able to create a new type of Christianity via the Council of Nicaea, to have Christianity be the number one religion of the Roman Empire, and so the slaves have now become the masters. Alright? As the quotation here says on my notes, you may be a slave on earth, but you'll be a master in heaven. Win-win, right? Well, Nietzsche had problems with that. The slave morality, while powerful, it allows the slaves to be envious of the masters and to cry unfair. Unfair. I'm treated, in such disrespect. I should be making more or something like that. And so, like I said, their number one weapon was guilt. Now, what does that mean? Well, Nietzsche said that if the slaves, right, if they can guilt the masters into converting into this type of slave morality, it allows the slaves to become the masters. And what do we get then? Then we get slaves who are masters, and then we had once masters who now become slaves. And this is a continuing cycle that exists throughout all of reality. Later on, at the end, we'll see how this not only applies to morality, but how it also applies to how the universe works according to Nietzsche. That it's all cyclical. You may be a slave now, but you'll eventually become a master. And if you're a master now, you'll eventually become a slave. Right? But unfortunately, though, when the Christians did become the masters, it ultimately became their undoing. Here's how. For if the slave morality wins out and stays true to their precepts, to their concepts, to their gospel, so to speak, then nothing will happen because no one had any power to begin with. Let me explain that in a little bit more detail. If you existed in the slave morality, that meant you had a low degree to power, and through a bunch of low degree of power people, when they get together, can eventually form a group that has a high degree of power. And once they become in charge, well, then they just kind of gotta look around and say, well, now what? Who's going to tell us what to do? Well, Nietzsche says, well, that's the inherent problem in Christianity, is because you got a bunch of sheep and very few herders. A very few, I don't know what, a sheep herder maybe? Yeah. You have a lot of sheep, but very few sheep herders. And so when you emphasize and harness and harbor and foster the slave morality, you're essentially watering down one's ability to become a master. Alright? And that's why he says no one has any power to begin with if slaves become masters. Or not if, but when. The only benefit that the slave morality actually has, that if victorious, they can become the masters, thereby validating Nietzsche's original position that the master morality is the preferred morality. Because, what do they say? It all trickles downhill? And if it all trickles downhill, then you want to be on top of the layer cake. You don't want to be at the bottom. Alright? As he says, it's an endless cycle. Next video, we're going to discuss how to maximize your own power. Sounds like a self-help video.